Will you just tell me where you were born and when you were born and a little bit about your family?
Okay, we lived about 2 miles east of Wizard on the old homestead that grandparents had, and we had an Uncle Richard that lived there with us, and I was born what I thought was January the 3rd, 1923, out at the old homestead of my grandparents. And sometime later we moved to a farm that the folks bought north of Wizard, and I didn't know, I took it that my birthday was right, and when I went to get Social Security, I found out that it was one day off. So I must have been born about midnight, and when they signed the birth certificate, we was a day off. And I always kind of wondered about that. I thought, here my military record is one day and my birth certificate and Social Security is another day. And I worried about that quite a little, and one day while I was in the mortuary, a lady came in and wanted to make prearrangements for her husband. And so I was kind of showing her everything, and I told her the only thing I could guarantee is where they was buried, because the minister and pallbearers and all that might not be alive. And so she went to hand me the cash, and I said, well, I can't take your cash. I may die and not be here. You may get mad at me, and I can't do that. And she said, now, you better listen to me. I was down there and when you was born, and I put on your first diaper. So we went over and put it in a savings account and just made me beneficiary. Well, then when we had moved up north of Wizard to go to District 17, it was 2.5 miles. So when we went to school, I walked 2.5 miles down, and then coming home, if you had a north wind, it was pretty cold. And I had a couple of uncles that was real good to me, Uncle Frank and Uncle Richard. And if I had any problems at all, they was always there to help me, because my dad was no mechanic at all. Now, he could do more talking to horses than I could to drive them, but he never knew which way to twist a nut or a bolt. He'd twist it one way, and if it was wrong, he'd break it off. So Uncle Frank and Uncle Richard, they helped me do mechanical work, and it didn't matter what happened. If I mentioned it to them, boy, they was there to take care of me. And went down to District 17, and that's when my mother was always on every year on the school board, and I think that goes back to her days. She was born up in Melbourne, and somehow she went to Custer College, and then she went up and taught school at Brewster, and then she went to Kansas City and took her nurse's training. Now, she never did tell me or know where she got the money for all this, but that's where her and my dad met. They both went to Custer College. So Mom was a nurse, and back then there wasn't much transportation, and the doctors would call Mom, and we had an old black saddle horse that we always kept in the barn. And when they called Mom to leave, we'd saddle the old horse, and Mom would put on some coveralls and take her bags with her. And she might not come back for a week, and that was tough on me because we carried our lunch to school, and if she wasn't there to make the lunch, all I knew how to do is fry an egg. So we had homemade bread, and I'd fry an egg and carry it to school with me. And we had a neighbor east of Drive Alley, I can't say his name now. He used to tell me, he said he had 12 children, and your mother, Allie, she delivered every one of them. So Mom was real talented with her medical, and there wasn't many of them around then. And the other thing, we went to Drive Alley for Sunday school, and she was the only one that could pump the organ. So she had to go there and pump the organ so they could sing. And so in the wintertime, back then you couldn't get the old Model T started in the wintertime, and you didn't have no antifreeze, so we'd hook up a team of horses to the wagon and throw blankets around us, and we never missed Sunday school because Mom had to be there to play the organ. My grandparents came from Wisconsin, and that's when they settled there east of Wizard. Grandpa and Grandma, and Grandpa was real good to me. When they built a home and went to Berwyn, why, that's when my folks lived in the old house and where I was born. And Grandpa had a stroke, and when we went out after the milk cows, you kind of followed the trail. And when he would come out to our place, he wanted to walk with me after the old milk cows. So, and he had a dog, and he always brought the dog with him. And we're going down the trail after the old milk cows, and I was slowing up, trying to stay with Grandpa. And pretty soon the old dog squirmed up with all four legs and looked down, and I'd always carried a hoe in case there was a rattlesnake. Grandpa said, "Now stop, that dog's found a snake." And pretty soon he threw that snake in the air, and it pretty near came down on top of me. I'd never seen anything like that. And when that old snake came down, I went up with the hoe. I was going to kill it, and it was dead. Now that old dog, every time we went after the cows and we took that old dog, if there was a snake, he killed it. And I wish back then I'd have had a camera to took a picture of Grandpa and that dog. Well, then when they moved to Berwyn, when I went to Drive Alley the first year of school, I was there about a week, and my mother was great on education. She really watched it, and they was short a teacher, and she said, "Well, you can't go to Drive Alley if they don't have teachers." So she sent me to Berwyn, and I lived with my grandparents in my freshman year at Berwyn. And it was kind of a long story. In Berwyn, that was the first time I'd ever been in a house where you had running water, and we had electricity. And I really enjoyed my freshman year at Berwyn, living with my grandparents. Then the next year, Dry Valley hired enough teachers, so we went back to Dry Valley to school. And my mother was great on education. She checked everything. And my dad, the only thing he seemed to be good at was penmanship. Now, when it come time for graduation, the different schools would bring the certificates in and have Pa write the names and stuff in it because his penmanship was so good. And I can remember he didn't have time to do it during the day, and at night he'd be in on the kitchen table with the old kerosene light filling out the certificates of graduation for them. And back then, we had football and basketball and track. Now, they called us the Little Six because there was Milburn, Gates, Dry Valley, Westerville, Berwyn, and O'Connell. And we all had teams. Now, our basketball was over in Lover's Barn, and that's where we played our basketball. And our mother had to always be there for football or anything in case anybody got hurt. Why, they wanted Mom there because she was the only medic that we had. And I look at it now, and there ain't one of those schools open. And here there was 6 of them. And we played 11-man football. And that day's gone. But they must have done a pretty good job of instructing us, because when Uncle Richard had me come out to California during the Depression and the drought here, Lockheed hired me and sent me to Glendale Junior College. And then I enlisted in service there because my dad was in World War I, and all I ever heard was foxholes, and I didn't want no part of that. So in January the 2nd, in 1942, I enlisted in service. And Mom had a brother-in-law that was a boxer, and apparently he kind of worked with Mom, and she learned to box. And so we always had boxing gloves in the house. And Pa had hauled up the old kerosene lantern, and Mom put the gloves on and box with you. And that don't seem like it was very important, but when I was in flight training, they played touch football, and of course I'd played regular football, so I didn't want that. I wasn't tall enough to play basketball, but they had a coach that taught boxing. So I went over to him and we started boxing, and he wanted to know how I learned to box. And it was 'cause Mom had taught me how to box. Now, they measured you and your arm length and your weight and everything, and had the different boxing with different classes. And I was coming along real good, and I was getting to where I thought I was a pretty good fighter. And they was going to fly us down someplace in Texas for a boxing tournament. where we boxed enlisted men. And I was kind of glad to take a plane ride like that and to be invited, and we went down and you boxed 3 rounds, and I caught a colored boy. Now, I'd never been around any colored people. And this colored boy was left-handed, and I'd never boxed anybody left-handed. And he had no expression. And he just slapped the snot out of me for 3 rounds, and I'll never forget it. I think it was good for me. I realized that I wasn't as good a fighter as I thought I was. And I've wished since that I'd have had a good golf instructor as good as that boxing coach was, because I think my golf game would have been better.
Didn't you say that one time Grandma accidentally knocked Uncle George out?
Yeah, George was down in football, and we came home, and Mom was in the kitchen doing some cooking, and George kind of slapped her on the shoulder, and she turned around and poked him. And of course, the whole kitchen was small, and she knocked him right out through the kitchen door and took the screen off. George was playing college football, and here Mom popped him and knocked him right through the door.
Didn't you say Grandma just wasn't afraid of anything?
Grandma wasn't afraid of anything. When I come back from service, I didn't know that you needed a civilian pilot's license. And when I went to rent a plane, they said, "Oh, you got to have a private license." So they said I had to have some light time. Well, I bought an old Veronica. I think I get $300 for it. And I was trying to do some flying around to get a little experience in it, and Mom wanted to ride with me. Well, it had a seat for the pilot, and then behind that's where the passenger was. So Mom would crawl in there, and she wanted to fly around Melbourne because that was where she was raised. And her Uncle George Butcher was out north of Melbourne, and back then they didn't have much equipment, but he had a thing where he could put his silage in it. It was big and round. So we flew over it, and Mom poked her head up to me, and she said, "Now I want to see how much insulage there is in that silo." So I went down low and tipped it up on a wing so Mom could look down the top of that silo to see how much insulage was in there. Mom wasn't afraid of anything when it come to flying. We was going down, and I don't remember which of you kids it was, but we was going down to something at the University of Nebraska. And the weather was bad, and I was IFR, and we got out east, and the plane quit me. And I contacted the center, and they wanted me to come to Broken Bow, and I said no. I was trying Loop City because I've got a north wind. So I finally broke out of the overcast and could see the airport, and I turned around to Mom and I said, "Now, Mom, we're going to have a dead stick landing." Pretty soon she raised up and she said, What do you mean we're going to be dead?" We landed there, and they had all kind of equipment there, but we made it all right. But Mom wasn't afraid of nothing. She liked to fly, and she wasn't afraid of nothing.
I know you said that one time some men were in a fight plug with each other on church property, and you told me that everyone was kind of standing around watching, and that your mom went in and broke up the fight, two grown men.
I don't remember that.
You did say on the school board, though, several times she ended up having to take care of problems.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, she, that thing with that school teacher, if there was any problem, most of our teachers back then were women in our small schools, and Mom could take care of that. She wasn't afraid of nothing.
Can you tell me about your first trip to the stockyards?
Yeah, we had, back then we didn't have trucks, and my grandparents lived in Berwyn, and we would drive our cattle to Berwyn, and then we had some lots where we could feed them, and for a day or two, so they didn't lose weight, and then to put them on the train, you had a crowbar that you had to move the cars with them to load them because you didn't have any power equipment. So we drove our cattle to Berwyn and stayed with the grandparents while we fed them and got the cars loaded with cattle, and we were going to Omaha, and I'd never been on a train, and they put us in the tail car, and of course it was cold, and they heated it with coal in that caboose. And this was quite a shock to me to ride a train. And we got into Omaha and unloaded the cattle, and we wanted to be sure they had feed so that when they come to buy them, that the cattle had feed and water. So we went down, and I can't tell you the name of the place, but we was in there to stay all night, and I'd never slept away from home, and I heard so much snoring and that in there, I had a horrible time sleeping. Well, we got up the next morning to go and check on the cattle, and there was a big bridge kind of walkway over the yard so you could look at the cattle. And we're walking along, some guy stopped and told Paul that he wanted some money. And Paul said, "No, I'm not going to give you any money." And pretty soon a guy came from the other direction, and there was two of them, and they're going to take Paul. They're going to rob us. Well, they made one move, and Paul made a move, and that was the end of that. They went right on, and Paul threw one of them right over the edge of the damn walkway. Boy, the other one disappeared. We never heard any more about money. But this was quite a thing for me to ride a train, I'll tell you.
What do you remember the blizzard of '49?
Well, the blizzard of '49, we came back to the folks for the weekend, and it just blizzarded something terrible. We got up the next morning and you couldn't even get the door open because the snow was drifted. But we had to get out so we could pull some corn out of the corn crib to feed the cattle, be sure that they could get a drink of water. And while we're there, I got a call from the airport manager. I can't say his name now. He said, I need you to come and do some flying for me. And I said, well, there's no way I can get to Broken Bow Airport. Everything is just covered with snow. And he said, I'll come and get you. And I said, there's no way you can come and get me. He said, yes, there is. So it wasn't long afterwards I heard a plane fly over, and I went out to look, and he put skis on his plane. And we had an alfalfa field just south of our house, and of course it hadn't drifted because there was nothing to hold it. The snow was pretty level, and he landed it. Well, I'd never seen a plane with skis on. He said, get in here, I've got to have you do some flying. And I said, well, I've never flown the skis. Well, he said, I'll teach you. Well, we come back to Broken Bow, and we shot 2 landings, and he said that I could handle that all right. And we kept getting calls for people out in the country. Of course, the roads then was just mud. There wasn't no gravel or pavement. And they would need things, and we'd load them up and fly it out there. We'd take them, if they had medications. And I can remember dropping groceries, coffee and salt and sugar, and sometimes the mail. And you'd fly over the house, and when they'd come out, why, you'd slow the thing up and drop whatever it was for them. Well, he did it and I did it too, and then when we come back, we landed with the skis, and we was getting along pretty good, but I hadn't taken any extra clothes with me or anything. I didn't think it was going to go on like that. And finally they kind of got the runways cleaned, and back then they didn't have snow equipment. The only thing they had was a team of horses, and sometimes they had a thing that the team could pull to kind of pull some snow off of men with their scoop shovels. And we got the snow kind of scooped off, and so they'd had a little thing that I slept in at the office there at the airport. And the airport, his wife furnished me with food and a razor so I could shave. And I was kind of anxious to get back out home, but the road was so bad that they couldn't drive it, so I'm kind of waiting for that. And the airport boy, the doctor had him fly a patient, and I don't remember where it was at, but I think it was Kearney or Grand Island. But in the meantime, we got a call from the sheriff in Brewster that he needed a plane up there. There was a pregnant woman that we needed to fly out. So at that age, you're overconfident, I guess. So we pulled another airplane out here, and I got in it, and they told me at Brewster that Main Street, they'd taken all the equipment off of Main Street, and they'd moved the snow off, but it was a little slick, but I could land right on Main Street. So I went up and flew over it and got it landed, and it was a little slick, and I taxied up where there was a group of people, and here come this family with this lady that was pregnant, and she was having pains, and I didn't know anything about stuff like that, and they wanted her to flown to Broken Bow. So we kind of get her in the plane, and the mother wanted to go too, and I said, I'm afraid that'll be so much weight I can't get off. And she said, all right, you just go ahead and go. Well, I got off, and when I seen the trouble she was in, I called the airport and told them they better get a doctor out there. Well, I landed and come up to the hangar door, and they had the door open and pushed me right on in, and there was Dr. Ted Kofoot. And the cot that I'd slept on, they moved it there. Now, I didn't see the delivery, but he delivered the baby right there. And then brought him into the hospital, and when they got the roads kind of straightened up, why, the grandmother contacted me to pay me, and you know you didn't charge for things like that then. And I don't know, it was years later, and I suppose it was 15 years later, I had the mortuary and we had the ambulance service. And at St. Paul, they had a filling station and a cafe that was right together. And if you pulled in there, he'd gas and check your oil and wash the windshield while you had a cup of coffee. So, and there was always a group of men in there, and so it got to be kind of a habit. If I was going through, I always stopped at St. Paul. Well, I was in there, and here come this young girl, and that was after I'd been here in Broken Bow in the mortuary for years. She came in and brought a cup of coffee and some cookies. I went to take some money out to pay her, and she said, no, this is paid for. And I said, well, who paid for it? She said, I did. And she said, you know, you gave me my first airplane ride, but I don't remember it. And I asked her name, and the last name was kind of familiar. She explained to the men around the coffee table that I had flown her from Brewster down, and she was born down here in the hangar. And from then on, any time that I stopped at St. Paul, if she was a waitress, she wouldn't let me pay for any coffee and I've often wondered, her mother stayed in contact with me for quite a while, but I've lost track of those people. But I've thought of all the luck I've had, and that country at Brewster apparently recognized what happened, because I had every funeral up there. There wasn't anybody had a funeral at Brewster. I always had them. That's sweet.
How long were the roads impassable from that blizzard?
What?
How long were the roads impassable from that blizzard? The blizzard of '49, how long were the roads impassable?
Well, it depended. Our airport, it was so important to get it working that a lot of people came out of Broken Bow with their shovels. And the roads, it was weeks before they was cleared up. They didn't have snow plows. We didn't have tractors then. All we had was horses. And after that deal from Brewster, they got me to Wysert and Pruney Boys, and then I had to walk on down to our house. Yeah, during the dry years and the Depression, the grasshoppers were so thick, they'd move sometimes that you couldn't see the sun for them. And I was graduating from high school and no money, and it was terrible. We didn't have any feed. The government bought the cows and shot them, and I they'd had an auction, and a guy that owed us money he'd put some cattle in our pasture. So Paul and I went up there with team and wagon. He thought he'd buy something. Well, he didn't get anything bought, and there came up an old motorcycle. And he said, "Do you think you could make that run?" Well, at that age, I thought I could. So he gave, I think, for that and the sidecar, I think $11. So we brought it home, and of course I didn't know anything about motorcycles, but I took it in Mom's kitchen, and that's where I overhauled it because it was warm in there. And Uncle Frank and Uncle Richard was so good to me. They helped me overhaul it. And I think about it, it needed a battery, and I didn't have enough money to buy a battery. Well, back then, our radio run off of a battery, and we'd have to take it to Weiser to have it fixed up so we could charge it so we could hear the radio. Well, if I disconnect that battery off the radio and put it on my motorcycle, it would run. So I didn't know what I was going to do, and they had some kind of a school at Kearney, and I just went down there, and one of the guys said that they was going to take a trip to California, and I think it was an old 36 car. I ain't sure of the make of it now, but I wanted to know how much the trip was going to be, and it was $11 a piece. So I thought, well, if I can sell my motorcycle, I'll have enough money. Well, I sold my motorcycle for $13, so I had $13 when we left Kearney. And I wanted to get out to Uncle Richard's, and I had oatmeal, and that's about the only thing I ate because it was cheap, because I was about to run out of money before we got there. And we got to Uncle Richard's. Boy, they were good to me. They fed me and everything, and Uncle Richard said if I'd get out there, he thought he could get me into a riveting school and I'd get a job at the Lockheed. So he took me up there, and they had a riveting school. And you know, being raised on a farm and doing mechanical work, that wasn't too complicated. But I didn't have any transportation. So some nights, from one day to the next, I slept out in the park and had trouble having enough money to eat. But they paid me a little for going to school. And there was a guy from Arkansas, a farm boy, and we took a riveting test. And I shot the rivets and he bucked them. And they examined them, and they thought they was in good shape. So they told me that I'd report to Burbanks to Lockheed. Well, I got up there and they checked your security, and we went inside, and they took me up to a jig where they was shooting rivets. And I'd never been in any place that big. And when it come dinner time, I was afraid to go to eat for fear I couldn't find my way back to that jig to shoot rivets. And boy, they was good to me. My old lead man, I shot rivets there, and one day he said to me, "Would you want to move up to the other plant?" And I said, "Why?" And he said, "I'll make you a leader, and you get 10 cents an hour more than anybody under you." Well, at that age, sure, I'd go with him. And I went up there, and that's when I got 10 cents an hour more than anybody under me. When Uncle Richard seen my paycheck, he just couldn't believe that I was getting paid that much, and it was because of my old leader there. And he made me a group leader. And that's where I was working when I enlisted in service. Yeah, when Lockheed had a school that you could go to. It didn't cost you anything for aircraft maintenance and mechanics. Well, I never had any training in that, so I was going to this school, and one day then there was quite a few women in there at that time going through schools because they were short of men, and they had overhauled an engine, and the instructor was going out and start it, so they moved it out on the parking lot, and they was afraid when it started why it'd get loose. So one of the boys got one wing and I got the other, so we could hang on to it, so if it started it couldn't move. Well, when he cranked it up, it exploded and caught fire. And that's when I got burnt. And what happened, it had an air starter on it, a compressed air starter. And somebody had goofed up, instead of getting the right compressed air tank, they put on an oxygen tank. And that's when it exploded. So that's when I ended up in Glendale Hospital with a burn. But fortunately, I had come from work and I had coveralls on, and I wasn't burnt. The other boy was burnt something terrible. And I don't know how many days I was there, but I was burnt and broke out around my whiskers, and so they was giving me a leave. And I thought, well, I hadn't been home for a long time, I'd come home. Well, I got on the train, and I didn't dare go in to eat because I looked so bad with all this stuff burnt. And I come back to the folks and checked with old Fenstermacher over Sergeant, and it kind of healed up. And that's when I went back to Lockheed, and then some attorney got a hold of it, and we got paid for that, and I don't remember the dollars. But after I got back and the folks needed some money to buy some land, I cashed that in, and George probably remembers, but I don't, how much money that I had. It was enough to make a payment on that 160 acres, and that's when we moved there. And so I don't know, I was burnt, and I don't know whether that's the reason I still had these cysts or not. but I have these little cysts all over. Okay, January the 6th, 1942, I enlisted in service at Los Angeles Army Induction Station. And the reason I did that, my father was in World War I, and all I ever heard him talk about was foxholes in the infantry. And I didn't want to be in the infantry. So I enlisted January the 6th in 42. And they sent me from the Army Induction Station to Fort MacArthur, California. And from there, they sent me to Atlantic City, New Jersey. And I've been in Bear since then. The only basic training I had was walking some formations on the boardwalk in Atlantic City. And while I'm there, they had me help in the mail room to delivering stuff and looking over letters to be sure that there was not any misinformation going. And then they transferred me to the Central Signal Corps School at Camp Crowder, Missouri. And I really enjoyed that. It was wire communication courses, teletype, installation, and repairs. And I really enjoyed that because I loved mechanics, and I'd never had much to do with electricity because we didn't have it. So I was tickled to death with it. And March the 25th in 43, I was made a corporal. And my dad just couldn't believe that in that short of time that I'd got corporal stripes. And I was pretty proud of that. And one day the sergeant came in and told me that I was to go down for a physical. So I went for the physical. I didn't know why. A few days later, they called me in to take a written. And I took a written. I didn't know why. And right away, I was transferred to the University of Nebraska College Training Detachment. And the headquarters were what was later on where they kept all their books and stuff. But anyway, I was there, and that was the one time the folks got to come down and see me. And then they took an exam for the upper and lower class to send us off. And you're supposed to be there 3 months. Well, we took the exam and they shipped me out with the upper class. So apparently my old teachers had done a pretty good job. And I was transferred to pre-flight as an aviation student at Santa Ana, California. Now, most of them were cadets, but I was an aviation student because I had corporal stripes. And I was a little upset. As a corporal, I got $66, and the cadets got $90. So I went in to find out what I could do about that, and the old adjutant said, well, as soon as you start flying, you get a 50% increase in salary. So you'll be getting 99 and they'll only be getting 90. So they sent me to Sequoia Field in Visalia, California, P-22 primary. And then we got through primary, and they sent me to basic flight training at Merced Air Force Base in Merced, California. And of course, by that time I was flying, and I was getting the $99, and the cadets was only getting $90. And basic flight training through that, and they sent me to advanced flight training at Williams Field in Arizona, and we went to work with the AT-6, and we had to take gunnery and multi-engine, and the multi-engine I had AT-11s, P-38s, and the B-25s, P-30, 22, and the UC-78s. And that's when I graduated there, they made me a second lieutenant. And I got an honorable discharge as a corporal aviation student. And we took our specialized training in gunnery and AT-6s. And when I got through with that, I never knew why, but they sent me to a combat training station at Photo Recon at Coffeyville, Army Air Force Base at Coffeyville, Kansas. So we took Photo Recon training, and we got through with that. We was to head overseas, so we went to Florida, and when we was checking out, you're supposed to put your uniforms and that in a trunk. Well, the trunk I had wouldn't lock, so I had to go buy another, and I put everything in there, uniform and shoes and boots and everything, and it just to catch up with us. Well, then we departed from Miami, Florida to China, Burma, and India. Now, we weren't told as a fighter pilot, and we were alone, where we was going. We had to follow a nurse plane, a B-25 that had a navigator aboard. Now, I guess I hadn't studied my geography very well, because every time I could see, we was over water. And we had to follow the navigator plane. And if we got in the clouds, then we'd change our altitude so that we wouldn't run into each other. And then if we was left or right, we went with the dida and dodit to figure out how to follow that plane. And then we'd go in and gas, and we weren't told where we was at, because the navigator's the only one that knew. So I'm not sure where all we went when we gassed. But we arrived in CBI, and right away went to North Mission in Burma, and I was attached to the 9th Photo Squadron. Now, our primary flying then was over Burma and China, And I think the most sincere thing I ever had happen to me, the sergeant come and got me and told me I was to report to my commanding officer. And I had always flown the right wing, and I was afraid I did something wrong. And I went in scared to death what was wrong. And we visited a while, and finally he sobered up. And he said, now, you're going to be a flight commander of a flight. We had 4 flights, A, B, C, and D, 6 in a flight. And as a flight commander, I had to decide if the weather was good enough to take off, when to charge your guns, what kind of power settings to use to be sure you had enough gas to get back. If you spotted a boat, what action do you take? That's the most sincerest moment of my whole life. And that's where I started smoking my pipe. John Greaves and I had went through flight training together. And when I come back from the commanding officer, I went back in the tent where we had mosquito nettings around it. We was playing cards because the monsoon weather was on. And old John Greaves said to me, he said, Ed, now Tokyo Rose had trouble with Everett. It was always Ed. He said, go watch the weather, because you can't watch the weather and play cards too. Now, I lost my temper and I went out to watch the weather. Pretty soon he came out, and I'd kind of quieted down and was ashamed of myself, and he said, now, Ed, here's a crooked stem pipe and some mixture 79. You smoke this because, he said, we've got to get along. I'm going to be flaying Taylor and Charlie for you. Well, he had always taken my cigarette rations and that I never smoked. And that's when I started smoking a pipe. I was just beside myself with that kind of responsibility, and see, I just turned 19. And later on in years, I asked the commanding officer why he made me a flight commander. He said 2 reasons. You was raised on a farm. If you got a tractor stuck, you had to figure out how to get it out. You didn't have nobody to help you. He said the other thing was you was always sober. Now, they give us mission whiskey when you come in, to kind of quiet you down before they went through what you'd done, and I wouldn't take my mission whiskey. And it accumulated, and I don't know how he found out about it. But we got onto English, we called it a limey base. And by that time, they had several bottles of my mission whiskey, and I traded it for a Triumph motorcycle. And he knew about that. I never did know how he found out about that. But that's when I started smoking my pipe. And we got into Missional with our tents, the mosquito nets and around us, and sharpshooters in the jungle, monsoon. And the Japs came over with what we called a Betty and bombed our runways. Now, our runways was just, the English had crushed rock. We didn't have any hard surface runways then. And how our mechanics kept our props filed and kept us flying, I'll never know. But here we are, and we have no way of getting any food. And I didn't know what we was going to do. Finally, a guy came from nowhere and told me I was to meet with another guy out in the jungle, and I was kind of dubious about that. But we had to always carry a .38 pistol, so I walked out there, and here was this guy. I never seen a man in service with glasses on, and he wasn't shaved. And it turns out he was the commanding officer, or he run the, what did I tell you the name of them was?
Merrill's Marauders.
Merrill Marauders. And I told him we didn't have any food because the Leader Road, they hadn't got it done, and the only way we could get anything in, they had to fly it in. Well, they flew our gas in and everything. Well, then when our runways was bombed, we couldn't have no gas, we didn't have no food. And he said, well, he'd take care of the food, and I asked him how, and he wouldn't tell me. So I come back, and I didn't know what to do. I went back to the tent. Pretty soon one of the enlisted men come in, and he said, you know, they give me a whole bunch of hand grenades. And I said, well, what'd they tell you to do with them? He said, throw them in the Irrawaddy River and pick up the fish. So our enlisted men was something. They would go out there and throw those hand grenades in, and then them fish would come up, and they'd catch them, and we ate fish. And I still like fish. And that's how I had some real nightmares when you strafe a village because your orders is to strafe it because there's supposed to be some enemies in it. And you're killing people, a lot of them innocent, a lot of them children. And that comes from being raised on a farm where the only thing you killed was mice and rats. You saved everything. You took the calves into Mom's kitchen and dried them off and fed them, and here you are killing people. Now, that's a real nightmare. And I can't understand, with all the technology we got today, that we can't solve things across the table without killing each other. I can't get over it. And it's a real nightmare to look back and wonder how many people you killed that didn't know anything about it. And when he made me a first lieutenant and flight commander, that's the most serious moment of my whole life. And then we used to leave Mission to Paradoba, India to regroup and replace personnel and some new equipment. That's when the war was over. And so I, of course, wanted to get back to the States as soon as I could. And I was lucky. I had flown an old B-25, and I got a crew chief, and we headed out. And I look back then, I had 3 navigators aboard because I didn't trust just one. And we come back to Egypt and had some engine troubles. And they got the engine changed. And we come out of Egypt, and it was them things that they have in Egypt you wasn't supposed to fly over.
Pyramids?
What?
Pyramids?
Yeah. And I've got a picture where one of the guys wanted me to fly over so he could take a picture of it. And so it came back to Georgetown, South America. And we were worried about the gas. But the old crew chief and the navigators was good. we come to Georgetown, South America, and then we regrouped and we come into Miami, Florida, and I promised that old B-25 if it'd get me back to the States, I'd never leave the States again, and I haven't. And they'd kind of kidded me about making big flight patterns, because in fighters we didn't do that. So I was going to make a tactical landing, and I called for landing instructions, and they give it to me. And so I came down over the runway full speed and shut both engines off and circled and came in. And I was feeling pretty good, and here come an MP car. And they took me in. And for making a tactical landing and wasn't authorized to. And I thought, oh, here I've got back to the States and I'm in trouble. Well, the next day they took me in front of some officers, and we discussed it, and finally an old major said, you know, I think that kid was just celebrating. And I said, well, that was part of it. And so I always kind of worried that it would be on my records, but it never was. When I got into the States, and I went down to Fort Leavenworth to get my discharge, and they offered me, an airline offered me a job of flying, but it was big airplanes and I'd never flown that, and I was going to have to fly co-pilot. And I couldn't imagine at that age somebody telling me how to fly, so I wouldn't take the job. And I went in to get a discharge, and all I could get was a separation from service. And boy, I was beside myself. And I had to sign up and stay in the reserve for 10 years. And I didn't receive, I got an honorable discharge from the United Air Force in April 26th in 1955. Now, if I'd have been smart, I'd have stayed in another couple of years and got a retirement for 15 years, but you know, you didn't look at things like that then. And you was kind of wondering how Mom and I met. And on photo recon, we went to altitude and our planes weren't pressurized. And somehow when I come in, my shoulders were just like somebody put a nice pick in them. And the old doctor, of course, we were just a small squadron, he gave me shots and one thing and another, and I had a terrible time. One day I come in from a photo recon mission, and the old B-25 was cranked up. He said to get in that, we were taking you to altitude. Well, they took me up a ways and flew around and come down slow, and my shoulder didn't hurt. And he said, well, you got something wrong. Something's going into your bloodstream. He said, we'll have to send you back to the States. And I said, well, if you send me back to the States, if they find out what's wrong, will you let me come back to the squadron? And he said, oh, yeah. Well, they sent me down to Oklahoma to the altitude check, and I never did know why. They put me up in a hotel, and the MPs would come and get me and take me up, and they'd run these altitude checks and figuring out why that shoulder was giving me such a fit. Well, then they put me in the Bone and Joint Hospital, and Merle was a secretary or something there. That's where I met her. Now, I go in for that check in the morning. I had all afternoon and all night to do nothing. And that's when Merle and I dated. And they found out, or they thought it was my teeth. And I thought, well, that's crazy. They pulled my wisdom teeth, and I don't know how many teeth they pulled. And I thought, oh, this, there wasn't nothing I could do about it. It was military. And then I went back over to altitude checks, and by gosh, it cured it. So I went back in the squadron then. And Merle and I, she wrote me letters. And we kind of kept in contact. And that's how we met. And then when I come back to the University of Lincoln, while Merle came up there, she went to work and got a few jobs and took a little college. And November the 27th this year, we'll have been married 60 years. And, I look back at our marriage and our family. Everything's been great. I can't complain about nothing. Now, when I ended up in this mortuary because the old boy got me registered at the university without losing a couple of weeks, and we was in the mortuary. I think about how fortunate we were. And one day he said to me, they brought a big footlocker in here. Does that belong to you? And I said, well, yeah, but it never did catch up with me overseas. And so I looked at the footlocker, and it was the one I'd had, all right. I had the key to it. The only thing was left in there was one pair of shoes. They'd taken everything else out. And I had that footlocker up here overhead, and Megan was looking for something, and I said, well, Megan, can you use that footlocker? Well, yeah. So we pulled it down off of there, and I haven't seen it, but she had somebody refinish it. So she's got my old footlocker, and I don't know where all it travels, but it never did catch up with me overseas.
Okay.
Yeah, in this, to get through flight training, they had a kind of an obstacle thing you had to go through, and certain things you had to do, and some of the tubes you had to crawl through, and those tubes was so close and tight that I was afraid I'd get stuck in one and couldn't get out. And we spent a lot of time watching each other, one guy particularly, to be sure that I got through all these obstacles that they had. And they found out that I was bow-legged, and when I asked my mother how come of that, she said it was because I started riding a horse before I could hardly walk, and they checked my bow-legged part. Well, an old P-39, the engine is behind you and the drive shaft came between your legs to the prop. Now the guys that were normal had trouble with that, but I was so bow-legged that that shaft didn't fall and give me any trouble coming through. And they thought that was pretty funny in that P-39. But that obstacle course, part of that was check you mentally, I think, too. And then we go to when I had to bail out, and they don't know. Several thinks I was shot down, and I don't know. The P-38 just smoked and started falling apart, and I don't know whether it was the airplane goofed up or whether I caught some ack-ack. Now, some of the guys think I caught ack-ack, but I was never sure. Well, a P-38, you're supposed to turn it upside down to bail out. Well, of course, I had no control. The pieces were just flying off from it. And you had to count to 10 before you pull the cord for the chute to open. And I don't know how to describe that few minutes. But the fact that the airplane is fallen apart and gone, and here you are floating down, and there's just a minute or two in there that you can see, you can move, and it was really something. Well, I pulled the cord for the chute to deploy, and I learned another lesson. When it opens up, it straightens you all up. Well, on fighters, we sat on the parachute and we had all these straps that come up through us. Well, when you got to altitude, your body would kind of expand and it was tight and uncomfortable, so I always left them loose. Well, when you parachute out and it straightens you up, it tightens them right now. And I found out that you want to keep them tight. Well, I was just south of the border and the jungle, and you're supposed to pull your rip cords to guide them. Well, everything went apart. I wasn't about to pull that rip cord and have that chute dump, because if you'd pulled it too much, you'd have dumped it and you'd have floated. You'd just been dead. So I ended up in a damn tree. And that's when I messed up that arm. But I got out of that, and the jungle's hard to believe until you've been there. The only way you can move is follow the game trails. Well, being raised on a farm and followed the old cows' trails, that was the thing I was looking at. And we always had to carry a compass, and I knew the only way to get out of there was to get over to the Irrawaddy River. So you'd follow the game trails, and part of the time you could walk, and the rest of the time you was crawling, and you'd follow a game trail, and maybe it'd go in the right direction for a ways, and then it'd turn around and go the other way, and you'd have to go back, and I knew that you had to have water, and it was so dark it was hard to tell, but I would take old dry leaves and lay them down at night, and the dew that fell in those leaves is what I drank for water. And I worried about, something to eat, and the only thing available, they'd told us in training, to watch the monkeys and eat what the monkeys eat. Well, hell, the monkeys has been there. You're no competition from them out in the damn jungle. And the only thing I could find, I could kick loose some dirt around with some trees and I could find some worms, kind of like fish worms. So I'd gather them up and take some green branches off of some trees and stick them in there. And then that I had the cigarette lighter with me and I could cook them. Now, if I'd have had salt, they would have been good. But and I finally got to that Irrawaddy River, and I knew the boys was looking for me, but in that jungle, the only identification you had was a mirror, and the sun had to shine on that mirror, and you had to be out so they could see it. Well, you're down in the jungle, you was never out where you could make it work. So I got to the Irrawaddy River, and I seen a plane land on the sandbar. And I thought, well, what's the matter with him? It was just a little plane. And that's the reason I want everybody to learn to swim. I swam over there, and I think he was an Aussie. He didn't talk good English. He told me to get in, we'd get going. I didn't think he'd get off the sandbar, but he did. Flew me back to the squadron, and it was quite a comeback for me. The old op and commanding officer Knapp was there, and he had, and I forget what they call it, worms or something, that crawled in around your arms and your wherever, your neck and that. And when he pulled up there, I was feeling pretty good, and he dropped my flight suit, my boots, and set them on fire. And here the guys came with cigars, and they would put them cigars in where they could see it, and them things would crawl back out again. And I don't know how long they worked at that, but around my neck and around my arms. And always kind of hated that because I lost my flight suit and my cigarette lighter. Everything that was in my pockets was gone because they set a fire to it. And I don't know, I've had so much luck that, and part of it was from being raised on the farm. Yeah, they contacted us, and I was to transfer TDY, temporary duty yield, to go with this group, and it was an English group of fighters, and I don't know just what happened, but they got in trouble and we took a different course and we run out of fuel, and all I could think of was getting close to water, so several of us crash landed next to the water with the Limeys. They didn't talk real good English, and we was there, and I didn't know what was going to happen. And pretty soon, a couple of little boats came up, and I didn't know whether to get on that boat, but I didn't know what else to do because we didn't have nothing to eat or anything. I had to do something. And we got up to these little boats, and they took us out in the daylight, and there we sat in these little boats, and I couldn't figure out what was going on, and I didn't talk enough English so I could understand it. When it got dark, why, here come this submarine up. And then they put us on that submarine. It was kind of funny, the lift things that they picked us up out of those little boats. And they took the boats, and we was up, and you could hear the submarine, some noise kind of buzzing. And, but when it come daylight, why, they went down with it. And when they went down, it was real quiet. You couldn't hear anything. It was a good thing to sleep. But then when night came, why, it would come up and move, and that's when I guess they charged the batteries or whatever it was. And I didn't have any idea where we was going or what we was going to do. And sometime later, we come up to next to a boat at night, and the submarine, the quarters was pretty small. It was pretty tight, but they did give us a little something to eat and drink. And then they put us on this boat, and again, I don't know from the way they talked what boat it was, but they were friendly. And then several days later, they put us on a U.S. boat, and they ended up taking us in, and they took me back to my squadron. So I don't know all the particulars, but the fact that during the daylight, they stayed under water, and at night they came up and charged the batteries, I suppose. Figured nobody could see them at night. I don't know the particulars on it, but I had a little experience with the submarine, and that was it.
Was that when you were still in Burma?
What?
Were you still in Burma?
No.
Where were you?
Well, I'm not sure. We think that we was in, what was the name of that town? We gassed there in Italy. We gassed in Italy.
So you didn't spend all of World War II in CBI?
Oh, no. But that was the only time that I really knew where we was at, because we weren't told anything for fear we'd go down and display or, tell something that was important. So we weren't told anything. I didn't really know where we was at till we hit North Mission on Burma.
Well, so why did you leave the CBI theater?
What?
Why did you leave the CBI theater?
Why did I leave for there?
No. Why did you not spend all of the war in China, Burma, India? Why did you go somewhere else?
Well, I have no idea. When the orders came through, you never knew what they was gonna do or where you was going. You just weren't told anything, because I was afraid that you'd get caught and divulge it. But I had a little experience on a submarine. That was it.
You told me once something about if you went down, whether you wanted to land in a valley or on the mountains. One group of people was sympathetic
and would help take care of you, and the other might turn you in. Do you remember that?
That was in China. And if you went down, you wanted to go down up in the hills where the people were friendly. That's where Bill Williams went down. And they were friendly and take care of you, but if you go down where it was populated, why, it wasn't, you didn't hear good things about it. I was never there, so I don't know.
Do you remember where you were and what you were doing when you heard the war was over?
We was in Paradoba, India, regrouping, and we was supposed to get more modern equipment, airplanes and personnel. And that's when I found out that I was a flight commander, and I wasn't going to be replaced. I was going to have to go on with the squadron. And that's where we was at when we got notification the war was over. And that's when I started looking for a way to come home. And by that time I got a hold of the outfit that had 47s, and they was going to use those to come home. So I checked out with that, and you had to choose your crew, and part of them was having to have to come home by boat and part of them flying. And so I asked all those that wanted to fly, and boy, they just pulled right out. So I pulled 3 navigators because I wasn't sure about them. And then I got a crew chief and I think 2 or 3 mechanics. And then they put a big gas tank in it so we could get more mileage. And that's the one joker told me that he could get anything we wanted, and he could speak all the languages. He was just a young guy, and I don't know why I took him. But when we got into Egypt and had engine troubles, why, he said he could get an engine, and I thought, and by gosh, the next morning here came an engine, and the old crew chief and the mechanics, how they did it, I don't know. Out there in the, not much to work with, they changed that engine. And I said, well, we better go up and fly it and take a check on it, be sure it's working. And he said, now let's all get aboard. And we got aboard and we got up and it seemed to be running all right. And he said, now let's don't go back because we'll be in trouble. So that's when we headed for South America, Georgia. And boy, that was a long trip across there from Egypt. And there's a picture of the pyramids there that we went over, and that was illegal. That was a restricted area. And I'd have one navigator talk to me, and then I'd talk to the other and kind of check to be sure that they hadn't goofed up. And you know, it amazes me. You had to get up at night up above the doggone clouds so they could take their things off of the stars. And you know, they were in just a few minutes. I was amazed how accurate they were. And So we got into Georgetown. That's the first time they checked the new engine to see if it was any good. But we didn't. Never had any more trouble with it.
Didn't you say that when you came back from a mission, the mechanics would meet you? Did each plane have their own mechanic?
You had your own crew chief, and then there was other mechanics. But you had your own crew chief, and he had, oh, I don't know what they called him, to look at a distance. And if you caught a little ack-ack or had a hole in something, by the time you taxied up there, he seen what he needed, and they didn't have any parts or anything. And our food, part of our food came in some kind of cans. Now, I can't remember what they were, but they saved all those cans and smoothed them out, because if they had to patch those holes, they didn't have any aluminum to do it with, and they used that to patch it. And I look at how those mechanics kept us flying, and you don't read about them, but boy, we had some real mechanics. Monsoons on, sharpshooters, no parts, and how they kept us flying just amazes me.
Well, I think one time you talked about having a red light and a yellow light and a green light during the monsoons. And if the light changed, it meant you might have to go up, you might have to fly, and you would have to make a decision whether the weather was good enough to fly.
Yeah. You see, our weather boys didn't have much to work with. And that was the trouble of being a flight commander, making the decision. And once in a while, you'd have a scramble with weather moving in. And that was one thing about the 38. You could get up on top of the clouds, and you didn't have very good communications, but a lot of times you had to find an alternate field someplace to land, because the weather had messed up your field where you was at. And I think part of my luck come from being raised on the farm. And when we come back, the government subsidized us some way with a GI Bill that paid us so much a month. And that's how I went back to the university. It's kind of a long story. When I come back and found out that I couldn't get a discharge, and just I had to wait another 10 years. I had to fly every so often in the reserve. So I thought the thing to do was to come back to the university and go to the university, and then I could fly right out of there, because there was a military base there. And I was coming in on the train, and I hadn't been home for 3 years, and we had to change trains in Lincoln to get a train that came to Broken Bow. And I'm in there waiting for the train change, and it was quite a ways off, and there was an older man and a younger guy trying to unload a casket remains, and they were just having a terrible time. So I went over there to help them, and of course I was young and pretty good shape, and we got the casket out and got it in the funeral coach, and the older guy said, would you go up to the mortuary and help us unload this? And I said, well, yeah, if you'll be sure and get me back. I don't want to miss that train home. And so we went up to the mortuary. In the meantime, we visited quite a little, and I helped him unload. And he said, now, the semester started, but he said, I might be able to get you registered so you don't lose a semester. Well, the next morning, he told me to throw my old barracks bag in a room. He said, we won't charge you for this room. So, in the morning, he woke me up, and I shaved and cleaned up and put on my GI stuff, and we went up to the university, and apparently he was well known because they registered me right off. And so we come back to the mortuary, and of course I didn't know just what was going to happen, and he said, now why don't you just stay here? We'll give you this room and it won't cost you nothing. So I come back to the room, and when I went to the college, here I am in military clothes. I didn't have any civilian clothes. And the GI Bill, I hadn't got any money yet, so I just didn't have much of any money. And so it wasn't long till he came in one day, and he said, now, I think a pea-shooter pilot ought to be able to drive an ambulance. And I said, well, I don't know anything about it. Well, he said, you've helped us keep these running. He said, if you're here and we get an ambulance call, well, why don't you drive? So I did, and I got $1 an ambulance call. And they didn't charge me for the room. Well, then he said, now on weekends or holidays or vacation, you could help us on funerals. And since you don't have the clothes, he bought me my first suit, white shirt and tie, so that I could help him on funerals. And he was so good to me, never charged me anything for living there. And stories get kind of carried away. One day he came in and he said, you don't mix with enough people. And I said, well, I've been out of school a long time. I'm having to study pretty hard. Well, they had the mortuary just across from the Cornhusker Hotel. And he said, now we're always having to buy tickets over there for some special thing with the food and everything. And he said, why don't you get you a date and go to one of them? Well, I didn't think much about it. And one day he said, now we've got tickets, and he told me when. And he said, now I want you to get a date. Well, I was down in bacteriology, and there was several Catholic nuns down there taking the course. So I asked the two girls, I said, I've got to have a date to go to this free dinner and walk over at the Cornhusker Hotel. And I said, can one of you go with me? And the one girl said, oh yeah, I think I can go. So when it come time, I said to the old funeral director, I said, well, I don't have any transportation. How am I going to get them? And he said, well, now, we've got them 7 passengers that we have for the pallbearers. And he said, you help us wash and clean it. He said, you take that out and get her and see if it's running all right. So I went up to this Catholic place and parked out front and went up to the door. And a Catholic sister came to the door, and She said, now I want to know what's going on. And I said, well, I told her that I just needed a date to go to that Cornhusker Hotel for this big deal with a free supper. And she asked me a few questions, and she seen that I wasn't a Catholic, but she said, well, I think you're honest. I think it's all right. And so we went up there, and that Catholic group never forgot me driving up there in that big black rig to take one of their gals to the eating. And that's kind of what started me to get interested in the funeral business. They offered me, an airline offered me a job, but I was going to have to fly co-pilot, and at that time I can't imagine anybody telling me how to fly, so I turned that job down. Well, the only thing I knew how to do was fly and farm, and farming from the Depression and that, I didn't want to farm, and so that was how I got interested in the funeral business, was that old man taking care of me. And I never had to pay for a room, and when I told him that I was getting married, he said, oh, we got to clean up them rooms, haven't we? And Mom and I lived in that one mortuary when we was first married. We had to eat out all the time, and when Megan got my foot locker, there's a thing, and I've got it in there, where we was keeping track of what it cost us to eat out all the time. So we, when we was first married, we stayed in the mortuary, answered the telephones at night, and I went on ambulance calls if there was one, and then if it was on a holiday or a weekend, why, I put on the black suit and white shirt and helped her on the funerals, and that's what got me in the funeral business. It's way out in left field, but that's what happened.
It's interesting. Do you remember, when you were talking about flying, do you remember much about the P-38, how it handled and what kind of missions you went on?
Well, the first twin engine was a 322, and it was made by Lockheed, and both props turned the same way. And if you pushed the power to it, you didn't have enough rudder to hold it, and it'd just fly off. So when they got the counter-rotating props, I thought it would never be better. And everything in our flying was so basic back then. The only instruments we had was the needle and ball and airspeed. We had no gyros. And the communications was ditto. You had to pass a 20-word thing on that, and that come as near washing me out as anything, because I could copy 18 words, but to pass that 20 words. And every time we got a replacement on that P-38, it advanced. I'll never forget when they put the supercharger on it. You see, we couldn't get much altitude to start with. And then when they got the supercharger, where it'd compress air and we could get to altitude, boy, we could get up to 30,000 feet. I didn't think an airplane would ever get any higher than that. Now, our cockpits weren't pressurized, but we had oxygen masks. And we shaved twice a day, so when we put on that oxygen mask, that none of it would leak out around when we went to altitude. And the fact that the cockpit wasn't pressurized You know, at the time, you didn't think about things like that. And when they sent me down to have these hearing checked, he said, well, could you hear anything when you got down? And I said, well, you held your nose and blowed and your ears popped. And he said, well, that's normal. But he said, that's the reason that you've got hearing troubles. You was up as fast as you could and came down as fast as you could, but they weren't pressurized. And he said, most people just drive up on a mountain and come down and they have trouble hearing. So he said, that's your hearing troubles. And that's when he fixed these hearing aids that really worked. And so when they came down, and every time we got replacements for that P-38, they were better. And we got drop tanks and stuff like that. And the ammo, I can't tell you, the guys that took care of the guns and put the ammunition in, they did that. We didn't know anything about it. All we knew was how to push the button to shoot. And the same way with the photo recon planes, they were Fs. And the men that took care of that put everything in, and the only thing about it when you was to take photos of a certain thing, when you come back, they had a record of where you was at and what you done. And the only thing I hated about photo recon, you always went alone. You didn't have anybody with you. Now, when you went on strafing missions and stuff like that, there was at least 6 of you, and sometimes all 4 flights went. So you had help. But that photo recon, I kind of hated it because you was always all alone. And I don't know. I've had so much luck that I shouldn't complain about nothing.
Well, now when you went on your missions, you were the only person in the plane, correct?
Well, yeah,
The
there just one
P-38.
person can all get in a P-38.
So would all of you fly, 6 planes would fly in a mission? Did you ever do dogfights or?
We flew formation, and as a flight commander, I was in the first plane, and I had 2 on my wings and tail end Charlie. And tail end Charlie stayed behind us because if you look at the pictures of a P-38 sitting in that cockpit, you couldn't see down. And the Japs figured that out. And they had come low, and they'd come just straight up as they could come till it stalled, and then they'd get airspeed and come up again. So there's no way you could see them. And that was the reason tail end Charlie set in behind us so that he could look down below us to see if anything was coming. And that's when John Greaves told me that we had to get along because he was flying tail end Charlie for me, and he did.
So 4 planes would go at a time?
Well, 6 of us. See, I flew the command, and then 2 on each side, and then tail end Charlie. There was 6 of you.
So 1, 2, another row of 2, and then 1 behind you.
Yeah, well, 2 on each wing,
Okay.
and a flight commander and tail end Charlie. And
So when you came across the Japanese planes, was it kind of like in the movies where there's a bunch of people flying around?
you know, it varied so much. The thing I think about on that, today you read, and these guys shot down so many airplanes. Now, if 6 of you go out here to hunt pheasants, and the pheasants gets up, you all take a shot at it, who got it? Now that was the way with us. If we tangled up with the Zeros or the Betties and it got shot down, who got it? we had no way, we didn't care as long as you got it. And now here's all this, oh, they shot down so many airplanes. I've got no record of how many airplanes that my fighter squadron ever shot down. But I tell you, that tail end Charlie was quite a job, because anything, the Japs would come in with their zeros low, and then come straight up, and then stall and come straight up again. And tail end Charlie was the one, and that's when two broke off and we came around to get a crack at them. And how many we shot down, I have no idea. We didn't keep no record of it. And when we was escorting bombers, those was long trips, because bombers were pretty slow then, and our P-38 was a lot faster. So we wouldn't take off till the bombers was going quite a ways, and that's when we had drop tanks so we could fly further. And then we would escort the bombers. And if there was any zeros or anything that was going to attack those bombers, that was our job. And of course, they had ammo and some protection, but our big thing was to rendezvous with them just before they went over their target, to be sure that something didn't shoot them down.